Okay, hello everybody. I am currently recording chapter five for the lecture hall session that was scheduled to be for today. I'm genuinely sorry that I can't run this hour of lecture live stream. Frankly, there's just a lot going on right now. And in the interest of just kind of keeping the quality of things consistent, but also just making sure that I'm on top of things outside of the lecture hall, it's actually far more convenient for me to just record this hour session right now and upload it to YouTube, and then we'll be meeting the following week. It's just a big juggling act. Like I said, I don't have a production team. I'm still kind of doing this on my own. So I genuinely hope, sincerely hope that you can give me grace in that regard. Um, Last week we were talking about the circumstances around essentially the founding of the United States, right? The basically the colonies transitioning away from belonging to the British monarchy and declaring themselves a free and independent nation founded on the principles of liberty, justice, and equality, while Black people, fully competent human beings who demand autonomy, liberty, and freedom, are now trying to hold this country to be committed to those values. And by Black people, I don't just mean those people who were enslaved, but also those people who were free the entire time, right? So building on that, last week we got into this interesting discussion about, white supremacy, white supremacist perspectives, and the origins therein. And hopefully, around the timing for this kind of topic, I think the way that this lecture kind of flows, we'll still be able to have that conversation next week because the entirety of our review of the origins of white supremacist ideology and things like that is actually going to be covered in the latter half of this lecture. I'm gonna be splitting it into two. Okay. So essentially, here we are in chapter five. We're talking about what it was like to be Black in this new nation, this new country that has founded itself. And again, established itself on the principles of liberty and justice, right? And so, for context here, what you kind of need to keep in mind is what we're talking about now is the post-Revolutionary War period. This is just after what I have called the original First Civil War. That's my own language. That's not necessarily, there's no academic consensus around that. Um, but post-Revolutionary War, you have the founding of this new nation calling itself the United States of America. I have my coffee here because it's the morning. Okay, and it's trying to because the United States is essentially responding, it's almost like a trauma response to the stressors of living under tyrannical rule, under a monarchy, under unilateral and sometimes ill-informed power that they are trying to find a way to split power so that it cannot necessarily be consolidated to one specific person, but rather that the union represents a consolidation of everyone's common interests, goals, and motives, right? So the states that are being formed here, these colonies, right? They are essentially mini countries, right? And these are mini countries that then belong to a bigger union. And to some extent, culturally, you kind of know that every state in the United States is almost like a mini country in its own unique way, because even here in 2026, each of these states has their own culture in a way, right? Perhaps you have regional cultures, but then you also have subcultures within those regions, right? So, like, let's say West Coast culture in general, whether that's from Washington all the way down to the bottom of California, is very relaxed. It's like outdoorsy, nature, sunshine, slow-paced, liberal, that kind of thing, right? But then as you hone in on California culture, perhaps NorCal culture is a little bit different from SoCal culture. Certainly, the culture in Portland is reminiscent of a perpetual state of being in the 90s, but it's very like hipster, right? I would say that Seattle represents a kind of interesting amalgamation of both Los Angeles or NorCal and Portland culture kind of mixed into one unique city, right? And then in contrast to that, we look at like the state of New York. Certainly the city of New York, which has a very different culture, division of power and labor and tax laws and things like that. I could go on and on, but my point is, regardless of whatever state we're talking about, wherever in the United States, the point is that they are in fact like many countries, and that these many countries belong to a larger union, but in essence, these many countries are allowed to then run their own laws as they see fit. Okay. And so that's essentially how you get the states is it's just a response to, well, we don't want to live under tyrannical monarchical rule anymore. So let's divide power. And in dividing power, yes, these states still belong to a larger union, but now the country is not necessarily susceptible to the evil, wicked ways of like King George, for example. Okay. So as we had established, part of what incentivizes the United States to ultimately win the war is that both the British and the Union were leveraging the manpower of enslaved people in order to win either side, right? And so they are promising these enslaved people their freedom if they contribute to a victory on this front. Okay, so where I had already established for you last week that the North was kind of leaning into emancipating people, but the South really had no interest in doing so, despite the fact that they were using slaves for the same cause. It's by this period that, in some circumstances, not all, and I want to acknowledge what Tanya was saying around individual circumstances too, is that people were, in fact, earning their freedom. Okay. Now, different states are moving at different paces at emancipating people. Some are certainly dragging their feet. Others are certainly granting people their freedom in large numbers, but there are clear differential rates of emancipation depending on where you're located and depending on the individual circumstances surrounding that individual's enslavement. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that there were, in fact, some states that just leaned into abolishing slavery altogether. And I'm speaking mainly about the North, right? The South really had no interest in this. But not everybody in the North was necessarily gung ho that you can just abolish slavery, emancipate slaves. Suddenly, you're releasing Black people into a normative state of society. It's just not a thing. Like it's creating kind of social conflict and tension because there are some people in the North who are used to the way things are. They've grown accustomed to enslaved people being in the position of the social hierarchy that they're in, and are not necessarily comfortable with this idea that now suddenly they're free. And then what does that mean for their rights? What does that mean for their treatment? What does that mean about where they're allowed to go? It's like raising more questions, right? Okay. So right now, you don't necessarily have the whole entire country all at once. What's happening is you have those 13 colonies, and as those 13 colonies are kind of expanding outward, they're kind of migrating westward. They're migrating westward over a short period of time, and essentially they're trying to figure out what their laws are going to be, how they're going to run their organization, what specifically they're going to do, how they're going to organize, how they're going to run their democracy, how are they going to essentially establish a governmental body that's distinct from the British monarchy. And so while you have this, you have the North that is in fact emancipating people in large numbers. Okay. And essentially, the congressional body that currently exists, let's say in its early rudimentary state, they are debating the expansion of slavery. And part of the reason why they're debating the expansion of slavery is on moral reasons. Part of it is on philosophical reasons, but the other part is economical reasons, right? That slave labor kind of poses a threat to the economic security of working class people. Because if the economically powerful that would ultimately be responsible for producing goods in large mass in order to accumulate wealth are defaulting to slave labor, then essentially you don't have to pay anybody for any manual labor, for any effort or any work that they have to do, right? Um, And so then that economically means that you don't have to pay white working class people to sustain their families, to sustain their livelihoods or anything like that, because you can essentially default to slave labor. So part of the political push, especially in the North, was not necessarily freeing Black people. Because entirely because they view the institution of slavery to be abhorrent or immoral to some degree, but simply rather that they have a desire to continue to work, to earn economic stability, to be able to stabilize their families, and slavery simply poses a threat to that. So many of the congressional representatives in the North are like proposing limiting slavery's expansion. They're not necessarily against abolishing slavery where it already exists, but rather that as they continue to absorb and take new territories for themselves, especially in the Northwest, that perhaps in these new states, as they're drawing, let's say, regional boundaries or state lines or things like that, that perhaps within those states, those are now states where slavery is no longer expanded. Okay. Um, and so essentially, like I said, that becomes a source of conflict. And just because you exist in the North, don't treat the North as like monolithic in some way, right? To some extent, it's just about who has the political priorities based on the circumstances of their own life. If you were a working class person, you were likely against the expansion of the institution of slavery. If you're one of those elite people who owns land, who knows how to produce economic wealth from the cultivation of that land, then you're probably in favor of the expansion of slavery, right? So Congress is doing this really interesting thing where they're trying to balance the dichotomy on both sides of the political spectrum. In one sense, they want to be able to fairly represent the people who have a vested interest in the expansion of the institution of slavery, but they also want to equally represent the people whose political values are against the expansion of slavery. And you can certainly see how this is going to become politically polarizing, eventually leading to what we know to happen in the 1860s. Okay, let me take a sip of my coffee real quick. Okay. So essentially in around 1784, leading up to 1787-ish, okay, you have Thomas Jefferson who is proposing essentially an anti-slavery bill. Yes, Thomas Jefferson, of all people. It's a little bit weird that this notorious slaveholder would also be the one who's proposing an anti-slavery bill that would ban slavery. But essentially, he's trying to like kick the can down the road, right? It's a way in which he can politically position himself to appeal to a certain number of people in the United States while also appealing to others too. So he himself is a slaveholder, but he's essentially proposing this idea that so we can end slavery by 1800. And ending slavery by 1800 would essentially be ending it from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. On the very next slide, I have a map of this. I will show you this map. If you're curious to know what this map looks like, feel free to Google image search like Northwest Territory 1787 or something like that. And you'll see a kind of regional map in which essentially Thomas Jefferson is proposing to end slavery within 13 years within this specific region. Okay. Um, and so in essence, he's proposing what would come to be called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Okay. And this is a highly contentious bill, but again, highly contentious because you have people who have a vested interest in the continuation of the institution of slavery, and then you have people who aren't. And essentially, this bill, so hotly contested, fails to pass by one vote. So it was entirely possible that in some parallel universe, somewhere out in the multiverse, in the ether, if it exists, that there is a universe in which the United States actually ended slavery, at least in this region, by 1800. Now, obviously, we don't live in that parallel universe, right? Um, so, in essence, the elements of this bill they failed to pass. Or, excuse me, I kind of fudged my talking point a little bit. Thomas Jefferson originally proposed a bill to end slavery by 1800, and it failed to pass by one vote. So they instead adopted the Northwest Ordinance. You'll have to excuse me. I'm sorry. It's the morning, and I'm still drinking my coffee here. So that's how that happened. Please forgive me. I'm human. Um, And so, in essence, it essentially did the same thing, but they're saying that it banned slavery immediately. Okay. Now, here's what the map is going to look like. Okay. Within the Northwest Ordinance, the map that we're seeing in this black area, um, this is where essentially they're saying that slavery is abolished. Okay. And so part of the Northwest Ordinance meant that as they are taking more land for themselves, they're claiming these territories that, at least up to now, have not been claimed in any regard. And again, not being claimed meaning they are disregarding the natives that exist in these lands. It hasn't necessarily been claimed by other Europeans. Okay. Essentially, then the Northwest Ordinance kind of zeroes out a zone in which, to satisfy the people who are against the expansion of slavery, they have now created a specific region with a number of different states where, if you're against the institution of slavery, if you have an economic interest in being able to stabilize your family, you don't necessarily own land or anything like that, but you have no vested interest in slave labor, then this area of the United States is for you. Right. This is that area where slavery is basically outlawed. Okay, and in this land, in this plot of land, they're providing orderly sale of land again at the dispossession and displacement of the natives, right? But they're also trying to build out a systems that are sustainable to what their essentially their goal is to establish an empire. So they're trying to support public education. They're trying to create governmental bodies and governmental bodies that regulate access to the land via border and things like that. Eventually, they're also trying to form new states, give these new states names, and then designate a governmental body to oversee the way that that state conducts itself and regulates itself and distinguishes itself from other states that belong to the United States of America. Okay. Um, so within this Northwest Ordinance, everything then that is south of the Ohio River is basically like you can expand slavery. So if you think about it in a way, it's like um, they're giving the people who are against slavery to some extent and for whatever reason just a little piece of the pie, but then everybody else we're expanding slavery. So you can certainly see where the United States, at least in this rudimentary stage, is certainly allocating its eggs in a specific basket, and that basket is to sustain and expand the institution of enslavement, right? And so that's going to sow seeds for more division because you're going to have Americans that don't necessarily want to be restricted to just this tiny little corner that they call theirs when there's an entire country that belongs to them that they could also live in too, but for some reason they can't necessarily live there if it goes against their own economic interests. So this doesn't necessarily satisfy anyone, certainly not the pro-abolishment people, but it also doesn't satisfy the pro-slavery people because there are some pro-slavery people that probably find economic niches of opportunity to build wealth in these areas that are now off limits because slavery is abolished, right? Okay. So essentially, like this ordinance is not doing anything productive or substantial. It's actually just kind of like creating further division, right? It's almost like where there are political aspirations and philosophies that are diametrically opposed, trying to satisfy both sides doesn't actually mitigate the conflict, it actually amplifies it, right? Um, and so that ordinance is basically like it's divisive. We'll leave it there. Okay. So you have people. Okay. There are people, they call themselves Quakers. These are usually descendants of European immigrants, but they themselves might also be European immigrants too. They largely have these European accents. Let me take a sip here. Okay. And they are forming societies for promoting the abolishment of slavery. And again, part of the abolishment of slavery or the interest in the abolishment of slavery here has to do with economic motives. The other part of it is like religious motives or like philosophical motives. The other part of it is moral or ethical obligation. So whatever reason, a group of people can represent a composite of different motives and agree on the same goals, right? And so for these Quakers, especially the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolishment of Slavery, um, and they are a society in which they are trying to politically lobby for the discontinued expansion of slavery across these new territories that they are acquiring, right? So I want to point something out here. No one is necessarily against the displacement of the natives or taking land that didn't necessarily belong to them. On that front, whether these people are pro-abolishment or anti-abolishment, everyone is in favor of expansion of these new proto-European colonies, okay, or quasi-European. What's the prefix I'm looking for? I don't know. It's the morning. Anyway, I want to point that out because often in history, I don't necessarily say that people like emphasize that like the Quakers were just like ethically and morally superior or something like that. But often people take away this impression that because they were pro-abolishment, that somehow means that they represent sort of like modernized interests on the current values that a layperson society has toward the institution of enslavement or racial segregation or something like that. And that is absolutely not the case. Okay. It's just that on the specific issue for slavery and enslavement, they represent a composite of interests that ultimately advocate for its abolishment. Now, Benjamin Franklin was the president of this specific society, but they're constantly running these campaigns. They're lobbying in Congress. They're trying to get bills to get passed that regulate the expansion of slavery. But in this circumstance, in these societies, really, it's only white people. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that to somehow mischaracterize the nature of the white people who are advocating against slavery. I'm not necessarily saying they're good. I'm not necessarily saying it's bad. But I do think that in a pro-abolishment society, which appears to position itself as somehow being morally and ethically just, that there does appear to be an epistemological problem when there is an absence of the kinds of people who would otherwise be enslaved. Now, we've already established that these people, black people, there were black people who were free during this specific time. There were black people who owned property, who were intellectuals, who attended colleges and universities during this specific time. And it remains to be seen or understood why they weren't necessarily a part of that. In one sense, you might be able to advocate for, well, they're an extreme minority, so it's highly unlikely that where you don't have the internet, you don't have phones, all of these political advocacy groups are highly localized, that black people, it's just not realistic to expect for black people to be a part of that. And on that front, I want to give them grace. But then on another, we still can acknowledge that black people who were free in these areas did in fact exist and were challenging notions of white supremacy and the institution of enslavement, but still did not find themselves a part of these groups. Right. So look at the realistic circumstance for what it was. It's highly complex. You don't necessarily want to just look at the Quakers as somehow being morally and ethically superior entirely, when there are lots of criticisms that you could rightly have, despite the fact that they are still pro-abolishment. Okay. Um, Now, they one of the interesting things here is that they are in fact advocating for compensated emancipation or reparations. Isn't that interesting? Is that while they are advocating for pro-slavery, they're also advocating for what we would now call reparations. Okay. And in advocating for reparations, this means that you are giving these people economic compensation for their loss, for their displacement, for their exploitation, but you don't necessarily want to live amongst them either. Okay. Some Quakers were advocating that maybe in this new land they're calling theirs, you can emancipate these slaves and you can give them a plot of land, like a territory that's specifically for them, and they can govern it entirely on their own, and that belongs to them, but it'll be whites only in these states. Whether the enslavement is abolished or not, it's kind of like white only. Or abolishment is kind of a given, so maybe not abolishment or not, but rather, if it is a territory in which they can get slavery abolished, that Black people don't live in these pro-abolishment states. Black people have their own isolated territory, a nation state dedicated entirely to and for themselves, right? Okay, so like I said, look at the complex reality. You don't necessarily want to look at Quakers as just being like bastions of holiness and piety simply because they're against slavery, because it's complex. They want Black people to be free, but they don't necessarily want to live among Black people. They acknowledge the abhorrent nature and atrocity of enslavement, while at the same time carrying sort of white supremacist notions and attitudes, not only towards Blackness and the segregation they're in, but also towards the natives that they're displacing too, right? Okay, so there were lots of different ways in a way that a person could be freed, and I suppose by ways I mean like circumstances in which a person could be freed, like the context of their liberation, right? One particular way a person could be freed, outside of like championing for abolishment and therefore reparations, was called manumission. Right. And the manumission was the enslaver literally giving their enslaved person a document which officiates their freedom, their liberation, and their ability to go and live their lives free and independent, right? And so part of part of the South, in its commitment to like we're incentivizing slaves to fight in a war against the British in which we're offering them their freedom, is not necessarily a transactional I fought for you and we won so I deserve my freedom now, but rather perhaps relaxing manumission laws or the circumstances under which an enslaver is allowed to free their slave. Okay. So an enslaver, for example, could free their enslaved person, obviously by a decree or a will or a deed or something like that. But in order to do it, they would have to go before a court. They would have to petition the state. Okay. And essentially, there is a merit of scrutiny. They have to be able to prove that that slave deserves freedom, that that slave has done or committed an act that is worth their manumission. And if they cannot prove or meet that standard of scrutiny, then even if that person, that enslaver, wanted to free their slave, they couldn't be freed. So do you see how the especially in the South, states are still governing even how enslavers are able to regulate themselves in this regard? And part of it is built on this notion that if you are Black, if you have melanated skin, by default, the assumption before all else is that you belong to somebody. This is how you get Solomon Northup, in his book entitled 12 Years a Slave, eventually became a movie, right? Where this is how he ends up. This is part of the reason why he ends up in the institution of enslavement, despite the fact that he was free, he was born free, he lived free for most of his life before ending up as a slave, is because the epistemological assumption by default is that your skin color is a marker, is a designator of your position in society. And in order for you to then be granted exception to that default position, you have to go through a series of steps in order to prove that you're even deserving of that. And then moving forward, the default assumption will always be that you belong to somebody, and you'll have to carry around these papers and essentially prove to everyone at any point in time, no matter how many times you have to, that you are free. You see how that works? Okay, I want to get some tea really quick. I'm going to pause the recording and I will be right back. Okay, I got my tea. All right, so yeah, okay, so the conditions in which a slave can be freed is not necessarily up to the unilateral decision making of someone else. So, what you need to understand is that deeply tied into the way that the United States government is both forming as a distinct body from the British monarchy, but also on its own, on terms of liberty, freedom, justice, etc., is that the institution of enslavement and its preservation is baked into the or sewed rather into the fabric of American society and the way that it's governing itself. Okay. Um, and so then you have other people, right? Again, it depends on the state, okay? And you can almost think about it as like the North, the shift from the North to the South almost represents a gradual political gradient shift in that the upper region of the South is like a little more relaxed. They kind of represent a hybrid of those intensely firm pro-slavery values, but then also a little bit pro-abolishment. But as you get into the deep South, that's where you get into that intense polar extreme, right? Of people who are enslaved, essentially remaining enslaved with no intention to free them whatsoever. Again, despite this, you have hundreds of enslavers that are essentially like freeing their slaves, especially in the Upper South, because they're honoring the promise that was made in terms of the Revolutionary War, right? And yet you have these enslavers that are essentially like profiting from essentially slaves. They make these deals with their slaves that they will honor their freedom or their request for freedom if the slave can essentially purchase themselves or like purchase their own freedom. And so essentially what that means is that slave is still obligated to do slave labor for these people. And but whenever they have free time and whatever circumstances that they're doing, if they can generate enough money on their own, over time, they're saving their money or whatever, they pay this amount of money and then they will be freed from their obligations as enslavement. So then this meant that you have people who are enslavers who are receiving passive income while their slaves are in some cases working double time, working overtime, overexerting themselves, or just trying to like purchase their freedom at all, right? Um, and then you have enslavers who are essentially manumitting slaves or enslaved people who were no longer profitable. So you have like elderly people, for example, like what labor are you really going to get out of this person who can barely walk, who can barely move? It's just there's no real interest in continuing to keep them as your property when they're probably just taking up resources that could go to people who are a little more vibrant and healthy. So in those cases, you could also like free a slave because you just can't get anything from them. So, like I said, there are numerous circumstances or the context around liberation and enslavement in this regard. It's not necessarily that. It's just by an all active decree, I declare that you're free because I said so. There are different processes, there are different contexts, there are different reasons for why a person is getting their freedom or earning their freedom. And you have to kind of leave some room to consider the realistic circumstances, especially as you go from the absolute end of the polar extreme at the north, where many are just against the expansion of slavery, some are pro abolishment. And then as you transition into the south, you get into this hybrid area, and then down in the bottom, there's absolutely no freedom going on whatsoever. Okay. So naturally, over the course of time, especially in these late 1700s, you are getting an influx of Black people who were previously enslaved but are now free. That's naturally what you're going to see, especially in like the Maryland area, the Virginia area, especially now in the DC-ish area, where there's a large historical concentration of Black people in these areas, primarily because of the history of enslavement, right? These areas tended to have the largest number of freed Blacks. Now, having said that, they still don't represent a statistical majority in the population that now somehow, because you can free some Black people, that now it looks like it does in the United States of America today. Absolutely not. Um, but obviously, the natural corollary is if there are an increased number of people who are getting freed, that increased number of people who are being freed, you're going to see a larger number of free people. Okay, so the South, by comparison to what we would call the North in this regard, again, Maryland, Virginia, D.C., that whole area, um, they're holding on to their slaves. Like I said, they have absolutely no interest in getting rid of their slaves. So keep that in mind. So by the time we get to the formation of the Constitution, right? You have the Declaration of Independence, but you still have years going by where the United States really is trying to figure out its political system, its political legislative powers, acts, bodies, obligations, systems of order, and bureaucracy. The Constitution, circa 1789, let's say, um, it essentially codifies black enslavement. The Constitution at this period in time is very much pro-slavery, sustaining the institution of slavery, trying to counteract slavery or slave rebellions of some kind. Okay. Giving other people, white people, slave owners, but then also Congress, the legislative power to be able to slaughter slaves in mass if they are engaged in insurrections. This is where you get the Insurrection Act, for example, that Donald Trump has been circling around over the course of the years of his what has been. We've just established Donald Trump never actually won any elections. He's been stealing them all, according to these Epstein files. That's been really interesting to turn of events. But getting back to this, this is where you get the Insurrection Act, for example. And they're characterizing insurrectionists and acts of domestic terrorism or domestic violence as a form of terrorism. And the language there is really just contextualized by the attempt to curtail slaves trying to overthrow the United States on this belief. That if a governing body is oppressing certain people or preventing them from having inalienable rights, that governmental body deserves to be overthrown. Okay. And so then on that basis, then the language of part of the Constitution anyway would say things like persons held to service or labor in one state, escaping into another, shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such a service or labor may be due. And the language here, again, is a part of the Constitution. It is designed to sustain the institution of slavery. Now, by 1739, or excuse me, 1739, 1793, you get where essentially there are many slaves that are not necessarily earning their freedom in some legislative or bureaucratically significant way, but still want their freedom. They can't afford, for whatever circumstance, to purchase their freedom, um, but are still trying to earn their freedom in some meaningful sense, and so are therefore trying to free. They flee themselves. They run away. Okay, because you're seeing other people around you that are getting their freedom, and that's what you want. So at the same time that you're getting an influx of newly freed Black people, you're also getting an influx, or it's inspiring an influx of Black people that are fleeing to get their freedom anyway. Okay. And so this is where Congress, for example, is using the language of the Constitution to then craft laws that are essentially constitutionally valid during this time, in which it allows enslavers to elicit the help of agents, right? Slave catchers that will pursue slaves across state lines, perhaps capture them, put them to trial, and after you present evidence to a court of some kind, then those enslavers can regain custody, and it becomes almost like a bounty hunter kind of culture in a way. Is an enslaver might have had a slave that figured out that if they made it into the North, where slavery was abolished, that they could essentially be free and no one could get them. And then this enslaver enlists the help of a bounty hunter who then goes across state lines on the promise of being lucratively paid for the return of their slave, and then goes into the north to go hunt down and track down this enslaved person. And then essentially bring them back down into the South and then make their money that way. Okay. And this is where you essentially get the rise of the sheriff's department, or the sheriffs anyway, the police, or anyone with essentially legislative power to enforce laws, with a badge and a gun by detaining people and detaining potentially random people, and then putting them in a cage and then putting them to trial and then essentially exercising power over their autonomy, is that this is how you get the appointment or construction of like law enforcement. Law enforcement in this context was never about enforcing the laws, the benign laws of the Constitution. The benign laws of the Constitution and of the Declaration of Independence were really just about the cultural precedent that people were trying to set here. Where law enforcement becomes important is where you have slaves that are violating laws, and then maybe there's a black person that's free in some state in the north or something like that. You can't just have random people show up and then grab this black person and then put a bag over their head and say, this is my property, I'm taking him back, on baseless claims, but that they have to have like merit. And that actually did happen to Solomon Northup in the 12 Years a Slave. So you did have that, but the idea was you're actually trying to get back the people who were your property. And in doing so, maybe you get people who had the legal authority to capture enslaved people, or random people, without necessarily having other people think of it as like they're being kidnapped in some way. And so this is. I remember a few weeks ago, there was a guy. I think his name was Darks or something like that. He was in the live stream, and he was talking about asking about whether we would get to the origins of the police or law enforcement or things like that. That's where law enforcement originally comes from. Is it wasn't about just enforcing freedom of speech or enforcing the right to bear arms. It was actually about enforcing the continued preservation of being able to own people who would try to steal their freedom, but to steal their freedom essentially where they otherwise were not legislatively allowed to. Okay, let me take a sip here. Okay, so essentially, part of the formation of the United States in this period, like I said, it's still figuring itself out while leaning into certain directions, um, is that you need to figure out how representation is going to work in Congress. And representation in this regard is a little bit tricky because if you want to build a democratic system, then ideally you have elected representatives that represent the collective interests of the people belonging to a particular region in a particular state, right? And simple enough on its own. But then in some states, you have this problem where you have enslavers. Some enslavers have hundreds of slaves, and they have economic wealth and standing that is built on the backs of those slaves. And so their political influence is a little bit distinct and different from the political aspirations of a person who is of working class, whether they're white or not, right? So you have this interesting phenomenon in which now, if you want to figure out how many congressional representatives that you need, you're gonna have to figure out how to accommodate for not just the number of citizens in a given territory, but also the number of slaves there too. And because slaves represent a kind of permanent underclass, they don't have the same rights or freedoms or entitlements that non-slaves do, and in this case, generally white people, that you still need to account for them while also counting them as less than a full status citizen of the United States. Okay. So essentially, the U.S. Constitution, or in the draft of the U.S. Constitution, they came up with what's called the Three-Fifths Clause. And this Three-Fifths Clause essentially meant that in order to calculate the number of congressional representatives that states could have based entirely on their population, slaves are not necessarily going to be counted as a full human being, but rather three-fifths. And because they tend to outnumber the number of enslavers by nature of the circumstance, um, you want to make them mostly human, but also not quite fully human. And this idea is not, it's not just on representative basis. It's kind of based on the philosophies that have existed in the years prior around these ideas of Black people inherently being more animalistic, less human in that regard, in some esoteric sense, right? But it's a way in which they're trying to figure out how to fairly represent their populations and asterisk on fairly, but fairly in this context being sort of calibrated to white supremacist norms. Is that you want to figure out a way to give adequate representation to enslavers and their political interests, and the people that they own that are under them, while also not necessarily counting those people as full human beings. Okay. So by 1789, that's where you get like the Three-Fifths Clause in the Constitution. Okay. So in general, uh, the production of cotton is like the main staple that has grown across the antebellum South. And antebellum in this context means before the Civil War. Okay, that whenever you hear the word antebellum, that means before the war. Okay, so right now we're talking about the antebellum South. And they grew lots of things. They grew watermelon, they grew peaches, they grew sugarcane, rice in some places, but cotton was primarily the dominant crop that was grown, and for a number of reasons, right? Cotton has lots of various uses. You can use it to craft clothing, but you can also use it to craft other things too. It's kind of like an essential staple crop. And because the environment in the South is hospitable to the growth of cotton, it becomes the main staple in this regard. Okay. And so cotton is primarily responsible for the current economic standing of the United States of America today. When I say cotton, I mean the cultivation of cotton through slave labor. Is that there is a kind of profit, productivity driven investment and imperative in building wealth and then trading amongst other countries across the world as part of the transatlantic slave trade. That you're growing cotton en masse. And not only are you trading for other goods, but you're also trading for money or monetary resources too. And because the rest of the world can also benefit from the production of cotton and the distribution of cotton in mass. This is how the United States of America essentially distinguishes itself as an economic powerhouse, at least early on in this regard. When you think about how common cotton really is, it kind of makes sense. It doesn't really matter if, let's say, you go on vacation to India, you go on vacation to China, you go on vacation to England or Australia. No matter where you go in the world, especially in our highly modernized and globalized society, cotton is everywhere. It's in your shirt, it's in your carpets, it's in the furniture. It's everywhere. It's on your bed sheets. Cotton is kind of essential to the sustain of comfort in modern human living, right? So that just becomes the thing. And so in order to accelerate the production of cotton, they're developing cotton adjacent technologies that help to accelerate its harvest and its production. And where people were early on harvesting cotton by hand, because again, that's all they really had, and they had a large number of slaves to process it. Now you have the combination of the cotton gin and slave labor too. So some people like to think, for example, I don't know how many people learn this, like in elementary school or middle school or something like that, that the invention of the cotton gin was built to replace slave labor and make cotton harvesting more efficient or something like that. That's not actually true. Yes, the cotton gin was invented to accelerate the production and processing of cotton, but by no means are any of these states interested in getting rid of the power that they inherently have in their ownership of other human beings, right? So the cotton gin is accelerating the production of cotton and therefore profits, but they're still relying on slave labor too. Um, you think about it this way. If you're processing cotton slower and you figure out a way to process it faster, then you have a faster way to produce cotton and to profit from it. But now you have two means through which you can increase your productivity and therefore your profits. So you can do it in both the fast way and the slow way, right? So the cotton agriculture industry actually created an incentive to protect enslavement, not necessarily to transition it out of a phase of relevance, right? Okay. So we're fast forwarding through time, obviously, because I can't go every single day of the year of everything that has happened here, right? But at this point in time, in the image that you're seeing above me here, on the right-hand side, more or less, is what the United States currently is by the late 1700s. Okay. And in the middle, what we're generally calling the Midwest here, that whole region is Louisiana. Okay. And Louisiana is owned by the French. Okay. But there's kind of a problem. Okay. And the problem is that, logistically speaking, in order for France to get access to its land that it's calling Louisiana, it would have to sail. Let me use my mouse here. It would have to sail all the way down from France. Let's pretend like France is maybe like over here somewhere. They have to sail downward over through all of these islands around the panhandle of Spanish Florida and then get to these lands and these ports right here. So then, in essence, in order for them to then access any of this middle land that we now call Nebraska or Kansas or the Dakotas or something like that, you're essentially obligated to then traverse across land in order to access this French owned territory. Same for like Canada, right? What we're calling French Canada is on the eastern side of North America here that France would then have to sail, perhaps come through these rivers, if you will, and then in coming through these rivers, then access this land over here. But it's incredibly difficult, if not impractical to some degree, for France to really lay claim to ownership of this specific region and then to develop it in the same ways that the descendants of the British monarchy are, in essence, developing these lands right here. So when Thomas Jefferson ascends to the presidency, he's essentially trying to purchase Louisiana from the French because it's like, look, France, honestly, there's nothing that you can do about this. And we could annex this land. You really wouldn't be able to defend it. We could attack this land, but that it would just be a waste of resources. And acknowledging that it really is impractical for you to even try to import your own slaves, to carve out the land, to bring in your culture and your language and things like that. Um, just sell it to us, right? So essentially, I don't want to say like literally overnight, because it's not literally like that, but essentially almost instantaneously, if you will, the United States, it's not really that difficult of a case to make for why France should just give up the territory. Okay. And so in giving up that territory, France essentially willfully gives up that territory. And this is where you get how like French culture or French adjacent culture is heavily concentrated in New Orleans, for example, right? In the southern region, especially in the panhandle of like Baton Rouge, and areas in Louisiana, but you don't necessarily see like influences of French culture throughout the Midwest. That is because the French primarily were only accessing the panhandle region of Louisiana, and rarely were really having or exercising autonomy over any other area, right? So that's where you get the concentration of French culture that exists to some degree still in Louisiana in the South. That's how that happens. But it's impractical. It's like you're just not going to do anything with this land. So essentially, the size of the United States almost instantaneously doubles, right? Um, and so in its purchase, during the Louisiana Purchase, it's not just about the territory, but it's about all of the things within the territory too that now belong to the United States. So essentially, France is basically giving up all of its economic incentives here because again it's really not practical for France to access this land in this way. So the Louisiana Purchase actually included black people. It included and by black people, yes, we're talking about free and enslaved, but not necessarily as slaves, but rather purchasing them to belong to the United States of America, right? So the purchase means then that the people who reside within those regions are now technically Americans, even if, let's say, they spoke French, they are descendants of French culture, somehow managed to make their way to the smack dab middle. Now they no longer belong to France. They're American. Okay, so that's how that works. I guess another example, I mean, it makes sense in the context of the 1700s, but to kind of put things in perspective for you, you know how Donald Trump invaded Venezuela and has essentially overthrown the Venezuelan government and said that Venezuela is now being controlled by the United States. Now, in this case, he didn't necessarily purchase Venezuela, but it would almost be as if, by virtue of now exerting control over Venezuela, Venezuelan people are now fundamentally American in the United Statesian sense, right? Yes, they're South American, and I want to acknowledge that in the nomenclature. But when I say American in this regard, I mean belonging to the broader political governmental body of the United States. Okay, almost done here. And I promise the latter half of these lecture slides still address the origins of white supremacy. We're going to get there, and I want to have that discussion. So I'm going to be stopping really shortly here in a few slides because I do want to run that lecture live. And I'm sorry I can't run the lecture live today. Um, but essentially, I want to have a little bit of a discussion around here we are, we're in the late 1700s, and I'm talking about the Louisiana Purchase. I'm talking about the Constitution. I'm talking about the formation of a congressional body, of political processes. And I want to draw a little bit of your attention to the culture that is being developed simultaneously during the late 1700s, right? So essentially by 1790, you have lots of Americans that are politically or like geopolitically distinguishing themselves from their European counterparts. And to some extent, that makes sense. You're an independent nation now. You want to run your own laws. You want to have your own culture. You want to have your own identity and things like that. Okay. So the notion of enlightenment as belonging to a collection or an amalgam of European philosophy is like American culture is starting to move away from that. Okay. And so, where Europeans are kind of like, I already established this last week that European enlightenment or notions of enlightenment always challenge this notion of like black inferiority, white supremacy, inalienable rights, humanitarian rights, things like that. You now have white people in the United States that are just kind of accepting the racial hierarchy as like the status quo. And in accepting the racial hierarchy as the status quo, it means that the slaveholders just are. Their enslaved people just are. The killing, the maiming, the lynching, the raping of Black people is just what it is, right? It's just the way that things are. It becomes the culture norm that like Europeans with their European ways and their perspectives, they're different. You don't many of the white people in the United States of America at this point in time don't identify as Europeans. Several generations have gone by where the white people that live in these lands have only ever known these lands. They know nothing about Europe. They don't identify with Europe. They don't relate to European identity in a way. So all of the things that are going on here are essentially normalized. And that really shouldn't come as a surprise, but it's important for me to mention that to you because I want you to kind of see the full picture here. And the full picture is that this is what is leading to the formation of now, where we get into a society in which white supremacy is the default operative norm.
It's the default operative norm philosophically, rhetorically, epistemologically, culturally. Anything around the sustain of Black marginalization, Black enslavement, the consolidation of political power and influence into the hands of white identifying people. This is where you get essentially that normalization. Okay. And then more importantly, you now have people who have a political interest, an economic interest, a vested interest in making sure that they can keep things the way that they are, that they like the way that the United States is run. They like the way that the United States organizes, the ways they benefit from the ways in which the Constitution is using race to codify, justify, and sustain the institution of enslavement. And so then on that basis, where the Constitution is kind of designed to preserve the United States, and you have people who exist in the United States with alternative political perspectives, they want to outlaw its expansion. In some cases, they want to abolish it. You now have a political group of people who run counter to the pro abolishment people who actually just want to keep things the way they are. And in fact, reinforce that as the United States is expanding, that as it's acquiring these new lands, especially in the newly purchased Louisiana territory from the French, that slavery remains an expanded staple. And that if they find an economic opportunity to be able to relocate themselves and therefore their slaves to a better plot of land or better circumstance, that they can essentially do so. They're free to do so without the restriction of the laws of a given state, essentially saying that they cannot bring their slaves into those lands. A few more slides, and then we're done here, and then we will actually this will be the last slide, okay? And then we'll kind of move on, and then next week we will meet, and we'll carry on with this live, right? So this is where you get, I don't want to call it conservatism just yet. I would almost say that, like, in essence, the political aspirations of the people who want to keep things the way they are is technically and fundamentally conservative, but because the United States is still expanding, it's still trying to figure out its direction. There's still debates about whether we go pro-slavery or whether we go pro-abolishment, and everybody's trying to collectively figure out how to satisfy everybody's demands and needs. You could characterize the pro-slavery stance as conservative, but at least now I would describe it as more like an alternative progressivism, right? Progressivism being a desire to take the country in this direction, right? And the direction they want to take the country in happens to be pro-slavery, happens to be making sure that things stay the way they are as the country grows, right? And then the other side of the progressive perspective is the one in which they would like to abolish slavery, restrict slavery as the country grows, right? So in essence, right, you can see how the pro-slavery side is kind of conservative, at least philosophically conservative, but technically they're progressive. Okay. And so part of what is helping to sustain the these notions of the evolution of white supremacy, racial superiority, and marginalization of Black people here is not just the economic incentive, it's not just the cultural incentive, but it's also a growing precedent of scientific racism. That you have people who are speaking on notions of racial superiority and inferiority because um, of like scientific authority, like giving them a justified basis for understanding how the natural world or the natural realm operates. That you then get scientific racism that is essentially the publications of these researchers normalizing institutions of enslavement, Black inferiority, and things like this. So you have um, by the 1770s, like I said, as America or the people who inhabit America are moving firmly away from European notions of enlightenment, you then get these American intellectuals, and by and large, I really mean white American scholars, who are publishing papers as scientifically credible and authoritative speakers that are then asserting that God created like a great chain of human beings that belong to higher and lower forms, and he positioned white people as inherently being on top and black people as inherently being on the bottom. And this is the natural order of things, and this is reflected in our godly, pious American society, and that this is the way that God has ordained these things. And if he didn't want to, he would come down and smite us, he would disrupt us, it would overthrow, there would be an imbalance. And so far as we can see, there does not appear to be an imbalance. Therefore, God must want things to be this way, right? Um, Again, not saying you need to agree with the logic, but you can certainly understand the pathology that would lead to ultimately the emergence of a normalization of white supremacy. And so next week, again, I want to apologize to you for not being able to meet with you this week. I will make a post about about this. I'll make sure it's in my story. You can see an announcement on the Patreon. I'll make sure everything is consistent. But I genuinely want to apologize to you for not being able to meet. Now, having said that, last week we discussed, we had a really interesting Q&A discussion around white supremacy and how white people were taught that really the thing that makes them better is because they're white. And I still want to have that discussion because that rolls right into the latter half of this lecture here. So I want to do that live. I promise we will meet again. It's just numerous factors of my own personal life are certainly creating a circumstance in which, unfortunately, I am unable to conduct the live stream this afternoon. So please give me grace. I apologize for that. And I promise you will have the Zoom link. The reading is already up. You'll have the lecture slides. You'll be able to see everything. And then next week we'll meet, we'll finish up chapter 5, and then we'll continue that discussion. Thank you so much for watching, for participating, and just keeping up. And thank you again for giving me grace as a single operative and functioning human being that is trying to maintain the discipline and the rigor and the consistency in doing all of this and juggling all of this, because I do find this important and meaningful. So please stick with me. I hope you're not too upset that I wasn't able to live stream, but I will be seeing you next week. Blessings and take care. Okay, let's see here.